The $250 million blunder. How a retired general with a pile of old junk managed to sink the entire US Navy in just 10 minutes. That is the absolute mess of the Millennium Challenge 2002. Back in the early 2000s, the Pentagon spent $250 million on a massive war game to prove they were officially invincible. They wanted to show the world that their high-tech, digital-first strategy was a strategic masterstroke. But instead, it became a nightmare. According to the classified reports, it wasn't a masterstroke at all. It was pure, unadulterated panic. Under pressure, the US commanders were so obsessed with their billion-dollar sensors and encrypted satellite uplinks that they didn't bother to consider a world where the enemy doesn't play by the rules. They didn't just build a digital fortress. They welded the door shut, tossed the blueprints into the ocean, and then forgot that someone could just climb through the window. The result? A massive global superpower, commanding a fleet of the most advanced warships ever built, was caught in a deadly game of Russian roulette. You could sweep the horizon with the world's most expensive radar today, and a $15 radio could float right back and sink your carrier tomorrow. This is the Millennium Challenge. It is a catastrophic failure that sent 16 major warships and 20,000 simulated troops to the bottom of the ocean. But how do you actually pull that off? Especially when your opponent has an unlimited budget and you are just a guy with some old motorcycles and a few pigeons? The answer is simple. You go old school. Understand how the world's most powerful navy was paralyzed by a handful of motorcycles and birds. We have to talk about General Paul Van Riper. In this massive $250 million war game, Van Riper was assigned to lead the Red Team, representing a rogue Middle Eastern nation. He wasn't interested in a fair fight, and he certainly wasn't interested in following the script the Pentagon had written. He knew exactly what he was up against. The Blue Team, representing the United States, was operating with what they called a $25 billion nervous system. They had the cooperative engagement capability. They had the Aegis combat system. They had eyes everywhere in the sky, satellite surveillance that could read a license plate from space, and ears everywhere in the electromagnetic spectrum. If you sent a single encrypted email, they'd read it. If you picked up a satellite phone, they'd pinpoint your location with meter-level accuracy and put a Tomahawk cruise missile through your office window before you could even finish your sentence. Forward. Van Riper understood a fundamental truth that the tech-obsessed planners had overlooked. Trying to out-tech the United States is a suicide mission. If you play their game, you lose every single time. So he did something the Pentagon's multi-million-dollar supercomputers never predicted. He went dark. Completely dark. He didn't just turn off his radios. He effectively erased his presence from the digital world. He ordered his entire military force to stop using any form of electronic communication whatsoever. No radios, no cell phones, no satellite uplinks, no internet. He plunged his entire command structure into a pre-industrial silence. Instead, he relied on a method so old it was practically ancient. He used motorcycle couriers to deliver handwritten orders chook-tipped to his commanders. He used signal lights and flags from the shorelines to communicate with ships. He even revived the use of carrier pigeons to coordinate tactical movements. It was the ultimate low-tech ghost move. While the Blue Team was busy scanning the airwaves for an encrypted signal that didn't exist, while their sophisticated algorithms were searching for patterns in digital noise, the Red Team was moving in total, eerie silence. They were invisible simply because they weren't digital. Think about that for a second. You can't hack a pigeon. You can't jam a motorcycle rider with electronic countermeasures. The US Navy's high-tech defensive wall wasn't just breached, it was completely bypassed because it wasn't even looking for a non-digital threat. It was like trying to use a high-tech motion sensor to catch a ghost. But the silence was just the setup for the slaughter. The real nightmare was what Van Riper called his mosquito fleet. He didn't rely on massive, slow-moving destroyers or frigates that show up on long-range radar like a neon sign in the desert. Instead, he gathered a massive swarm, hundreds upon hundreds of small, incredibly fast fiberglass boats. These were essentially civilian-style craft, fishing trawlers, pleasure boats, and heavily modified speedboats. To the Blue Team's sophisticated radar systems, Ningchik Twin Nai looked like ordinary civilian traffic, just the everyday background noise of a busy, bustling shipping lane. They blended in perfectly with the chaos of the commercial world. The Blue Team saw them, but they didn't recognize them as a threat. And then, without a single radio command being intercepted, the swarm hit. Imagine the scene inside the Combat Information Center of a billion-dollar Aegis destroyer. You're looking at the world's most advanced holographic displays, Everything is quiet, controlled, and professional. And then suddenly the screens explode into a chaotic mess of icons. Hundreds of small, fast-moving targets appear from every single direction at once, coming in from 360 degrees. They are too small and too close to be effectively engaged by heavy long-range SM-2 missiles, and there are far too many of them for the ship's close-in weapon systems, those Phalanx R2-D2 guns, to track and destroy simultaneously. It is a textbook saturation attack, a lethal game of numbers. It wasn't a strategic masterstroke in the traditional sense. It was a swarm of angry, lethal hornets. Cool. The red team's small boats didn't try to trade shots with the heavy hitters one-on-one. They darted in close, under the radar horizon, launched light anti-ship missiles and torpedoes at point-blank range, and then floored it back toward the safety of the coastline before the heavy U.S. warships could even get a weapon lock on them. It was hit-and-run tactics on a global, catastrophic scale. The chaos in the blue team's command center was absolute. The communication lines were flooded with frantic reports of incoming strikes from every quadrant. The decision-making process, which relied entirely on having a clear, sanitized digital picture of the battlefield, completely collapsed under the weight of the raw, chaotic reality. They were drowning in more data than they could process. The blue team was so focused on blocking a high-tech long-range punch that they never saw the 1,000 tiny needles coming for their throat. It was pure, unadulterated panic in the middle of the ocean. High-ranking officers were watching their multi-million-dollar ships vanish from the digital tactical map in real time, one after another, like lights being snuffed out in a storm. The statistical reality of the disaster was staggering. In less than 10 minutes of simulated combat, the red team successfully sank 16 major warships. We aren't just talking about small patrol boats. They sent a massive, nuclear-powered aircraft carrier to the bottom. They destroyed cruisers. They obliterated 5 amphibious assault ships. If this had been a real conflict, if the simulation had used real blood instead of pixels, more than 20,000 American sailors and Marines would have been lost in a single morning. It was the single most humiliating defeat in the history of U.S. military simulations. The world's most advanced Navy had been decapitated by a force that didn't even have a computer network. The result was a total strategic catastrophe. About 80% of the fleet's striking power was wiped out before they even had the chance to fire a return shot. The blue team had built a massive, expensive wall of technology, but General Van Riper didn't try to climb over it or break through it. He just walked around it. The U.S. Navy had welded the door shut and tossed the blueprints, but they forgot that a locksmith doesn't always need a key. Sometimes they just need a heavy hammer and the element of surprise. This wasn't just a loss for the Pentagon. It was a revelation that the entire playbook for modern high-tech warfare might be fundamentally broken. The atmosphere at the Pentagon following the exercise was one of profound shock and disbelief. They had spent $250 million to prove they were unbeatable, to demonstrate that their network-centric warfare was the future. Instead, they had proven they were dangerously vulnerable to a radio that costs as much as a lunch and a bird that eats seeds. This was the ultimate mosquito fleet strategy in action, showing that in a tight bottleneck, low tech can be lethally effective. But how do you actually pull that off consistently? How do chick twin Banyarne and low-tech gadgets actually manage to defeat a system that can track objects in orbit? The answer isn't just luck. It lies in the specific technical flaws and the psychological blind spots that General Van Riper exploited. It usually comes down to the way we've built our machines to think. Let's look deeper into the technical reality of why old school beat the new school. But how did a system that can track an object the size of a golf ball in low Earth orbit fail to detect a massive swarm of boats until they were literally touching the hull? How does a $15 radio defeat a $25 billion nervous system? The answer isn't just luck. It lies in a series of brilliant technical exploitations that targeted the very core of how modern militaries think. Let's look at strategy number 1, the radio frequency paradox. This is the ultimate aha moment of the entire exercise. The U.S. Navy uses the most sophisticated electronic warfare suites in the world. They are designed to detect, jam, and intercept high-end, encrypted military communications. Think satellite uplinks, microwave bursts, and frequency-hopping digital radios. These systems are incredibly efficient, but they are also incredibly specific. General Van Riper knew that if he used high-tech radios, he'd be playing right into the hands of the U.S. signals intelligence teams. So, he went the opposite direction. He equipped his forces with cheap, low-tech, commercially available walkie-talkies and civilian band radios. We're talking about the kind of stuff you can buy at a local electronics store for the price of a decent lunch. Why does this work? Because the US radar and SIGINT systems were effectively programmed to filter out NUDs. In a busy, crowded waterway like the Persian Gulf, there is a massive amount of civilian radio traffic, fishing boats, merchant tankers, and local harbor pilots all talking at once. The US systems are tuned to ignore this background static and look specifically for the complex, crypted signatures of enemy military hardware. By using low-power, civilian-band frequencies, Van Riper's commands were hidden in plain sight. They didn't look like an invading army. They looked like 1,000 fishermen talking about the weather. It was a textbook case of hiding a needle in a haystack by making the needle look exactly like a piece of hay. The US sensors were so advanced that they had actually become blind to the simple. Then comes strategy number 2, the unhackable light. When Van Riper realized that even a low-power radio might eventually be triangulated, he switched to a technology that is literally thousands of years old: signal lamps and semaphore flags. This is pure technical genius in its simplicity. You cannot jam a beam of light. You cannot hack a mirror. You cannot intercept a flag signal using a digital eavesdropping device. By using line-of-sight visual communication, the Red Team created a network that was completely isolated from the digital battlefield. To the Blue Team's computer models, which relied on seeing the enemy through electronic emissions, the Red Team effectively ceased to exist. They were ghosts moving in the dark, communicating in a language that the US and computers didn't even know they should be looking for. But strategy number 3 is where the math really turns lethal: the swarm saturation. This is a cold, hard Baituan sack swat. Every defensive system, no matter how advanced, has a finite capacity. A billion-dollar Aegis destroyer has a specific number of fire control channels. It can track a specific number of incoming threats, and it can guide a specific Solunk missiles to those targets simultaneously. If a ship can track 20 targets at once, and you send 21, one is going to get through. Van Riper didn't send 21, he sent hundreds. By presenting the US Navy with more targets than their computers could physically process, he caused a total system overload. The US defensive systems were like a high-speed processor trying to run 1 million programs at once. Eventually, the spinning wheel of death appears and the system crashes. 4. The technical reality is that you don't need to be better than $1 billion ship, but you just need to be more numerous than its tracking capacity. 100 small fiberglass boats, each costing less than a high-end luxury car, can effectively suffocate a destroyer. It's the military equivalent of a DDoS attack on a website, but instead of fake traffic, it's real explosives hitting a real hull. Now, here's the real twist, the moment where the simulation turns into a farce. After less than 10 minutes of combat, the Blue Team realized they had lost. Their fleet was at the bottom of the ocean. The experiment they had spent $250 million on was over before it had even begun. But instead of accepting the result, instead of learning the lesson that their digital wall was broken, the Pentagon did something absolutely unbelievable. They hit the reset button. They literally ordered the sunken ships to respawn. They told the Red Team that their hits didn't count. They forced the Blue Team's fleet to come back to life, and then they changed the rules of the game. They ordered General Van Riper to turn his radios back on. They told him he wasn't allowed to use motorcycles or messengers. They even told him he had to move his defensive systems into the open so the US could find and destroy them easily. It wasn't a war game anymore. It was a scripted movie where the ending was already decided. The US military was so addicted to their own data, so convinced of their own digital superiority, that they would rather cheat in a simulation than face the reality that a $15 radio had just decapitated their navy. This is a classic case of data-driven failure. The planners were so focused on their clean digital map, the one that showed them exactly what they wanted to see, that they ignored the messy real world. They forgot that war isn't played out on a spreadsheet. It's played out in the chaos of the physical world. They had welded the door shut and tossed the blueprints, but when a locksmith showed up with a simple hammer, they chose to pretend the door was still there. This isn't just an isolated incident in history. We see this pattern again and again. Whether it was the 26 mines in the Dardanelles that changed the course of World War I or the small mosquito fleets in the Strait of Hormuz today, the lesson is always the same. Technology is a tool, a powerful one, but it can also be a blindfold. If you rely too heavily on the data on your screen, you might miss the very real needle coming for your throat. It reminds us that in a tight bottleneck, the most high-tech radar in the world is only as good as the person who remembers to look out the window. It underscoring a crucial point. Understanding the technical flaws of the systems we build is the only way to prevent them from becoming our own traps. Let's take a look at the historical proof of how these low-tech surprises have turned the tide of real conflicts time and time after again. The Millennium Challenge wasn't an anomaly in a computer lab. It was a warning shot that echoed through a century of military history. We've seen this pattern before. In 1915, it wasn't a massive dreadnought that decided the fate of the Dardanelles. It was a single row of 26 simple old-school mines that sent the British Empire packing. In the Strait of Hormuz today, it isn't the billion-dollar destroyers that keep the world's oil supply on a knife's edge. It's a swarm of fiberglass speedboats and sailors with handheld radios. The lesson is undeniable. Technology is a powerful tool, but it is also a rigid one. It relies on logic, predictable patterns, and established rules. But war? War is inherently chaotic. The Pentagon built a digital wall so high they couldn't see over it, forgetting that the most lethal weapon on any battlefield isn't a satellite or a supercomputer. It's human creativity, the ability to look at a billion-dollar problem and solve it with a $15 radio. Understanding these technical blind spots, the ones hidden deep in the code and the sensors, is the only way to see through the fog of modern conflict. We make original videos from scratch, deeply researched and animated by humans to bring these complex mechanical systems to life. Well, if you want more of these hardcore technical breakdowns and a look behind the curtain of global military engineering, hit subscribe, because in a world of automated systems, the most important sensor is still the one between your ears. We'll see you in the next one.